Hello and welcome to Written in Uncertainty, an Elder Scrolls podcast sat firmly in the grey maybe of Tamriel and proud member of the Robots Radio podcast network. My name is Aramithius, and today we're not asking just one question, we are answering a bunch. This is currently being streamed live on twitch.tv/Aramithius, and I've got a bunch of questions that people have been sending me over the past few weeks, months, whenever, just for me to dig into and answer based on what people want to know. There's also a bunch of kind of smaller questions that I don't really think would necessarily make a full episode. So yeah, there's lots of little bits and pieces that we're going to be going through, and also possibly answering some questions from chat. So if you are in chat and wanting some questions answers, just hit Q at the start of your question so I can find it easily, and then we'll get back to you. So first things first, I've got a question from Demon Turtle. In the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, Cyrus mentions an Akaviri mongrel to his half-Nord friend Tobias. I don't want to explain too much, I'm just going to link some sources. I'm just interested in how this is possible. It's possible because, well, the reason that Demon Turtle is asking this is because Akavir is full of a whole bunch of different species from Tamriel. They've got the Tangmo, they've got the Capotan, and the Saisi, who are variously kind of, they are cat people, monkey people, and the Saisi being immortal vampire snake men, as well as the Kamal, who are ice demons. So how on earth is this stuff meant to breed with anything on Tamriel is basically what Demon Turtle is getting at. But the reason I think that's possible, and we know elsewhere in the lore as well that it's possible that you've got some Akaviri influences as well. The Imperial line particularly, or everyone in Cyrodiil, not everyone in Cyrodiil, but bits of Cyrodiil have some Akaviri in their ancestry. Some of the families have Akaviri surnames, and they kind of guard their bloodlines and try and keep vaguely true to the Akaviri way as such. The reason that it's possible, I think, is possibly because the Saisi aren't necessarily vampire snake men, that the Saisi are a race of men. There is reference in the book Mysterious Akavir that men once did once did live in Akavir, and the Saisi ate them. But there's also indications that the Saisi are actually men, because you've got the ability to breed in Cyrodiil, as I said, from what I'm presuming is the invasions that people have been having. So at least one of the invasions left a population where they could breed on Tamriel, which I'm assuming for now is the Saisi, seeing as there's some question over quite what the Saisi are. There's some suggestion that the Saisi may have eaten them on Akavir, and that's why there's no men as such in Akavir. But there's also the suggestion, if you look at the Saisi creation myth, which says that we ate it to become it. That's kind of the subtitle of the myth. So if the Saisi, the immortal vampire snake men, ate the men of Akavir, they became the men of Akavir. There's also some suggestion that they at one point looked like men. So yeah, we've got a lot of possibilities that suggest that this Saisi are in fact a type of men, rather than anything particularly different from what's already on Tamriel. Tristan Warneke, or Varneke, I'm not sure how to pronounce that surname, I'm afraid, just says, I'm very curious about the Dwemer relationship with the farmer, and specifically this Reddit thread, which is a thread that talks about the failed ascension of the Falmer. And Tristan says, the basic idea is that the Dwemer used the Snow Elves and took advantage of them to experiment on them see if they could make use of the tonal frequencies of the Arabis. I'm not nearly as eloquent as they are. My question to you is that is this something that's A, possible, B, fits the Dwemer personality, is it something they would do, and C, what would they hope to achieve? D, is this a credible theory, or is the more general theory of the Dwemer making the Snow Elves slaves more likely? That's quite a bit to unpack, but I'll get there. First of all, it definitely seems that it's possible, given some of the final points of Calsalmo's stone, which I'm just going to pull up now. I have really not prepared properly for this, and Baconomics in chat is saying that Calsalmo's stone mentions it as a gift, which is not necessarily a gift, I don't think. If I can actually type correctly, I will bring this up. Apologies for those of you listening to this on a podcast and getting all the clattering. We've got, if I'm looking for something like gift, if I can type again, it's not necessarily that it's that. The condition of the Dwemer taking the Falmer in and making them safe against the depredations of the Nords was that we only request that you partake of the symbol of our bond, the fruit of the stones around us. And as your vision clouds, as the darkness sets in, fear not, knowing only our mercy and the radiance of our affection, which unbinds your bones to the earth before and sets your final path to the music of your new eternity. Now that is gloriously cryptic, but I think that it really fits. It's not necessarily something that is taking advantage of the tonal frequencies of the Arabis, but it feels like the Dwemer are using the Falmer for something other than basic slavery, that they're trying to make them into something else, that they are trying to unbind their bones from the earth before, which is a reference to the earth bones, to the laws of physics on Nirn. So they are trying to separate them from the laws of physics somehow, rather than necessarily just making them slaves. And I am getting comments in the chat from Mr. Gummy Boy, saying, so does that mean that the Falmer sacrificed their souls or something? I was about to say no, because the Falmer do still exist, but if you look at the Elder Scrolls 5, the Falmer have white souls, they don't have black souls, so they've possibly devolved. So the sentient part of their soul, or sapient part of their soul, I should say, has possibly gone somewhere else. I don't know for sure, or it might just be that they've devolved in their state afterwards. I think that just to go back to the other bits of the question, see what would they hope to achieve. I don't think it necessarily relates to the it doesn't necessarily relate to the idea of the Arabis being a song underneath it all, which is something that Michael Kirkbride has talked about unofficially in the forums and so on, but it feels like it fits an awful lot. So I don't think that it's necessarily that. Part of the argumentation in the Reddit thread was that it's the idea of you remove one sense and the rest of them get keener. That if you're blind, then you'll be able to hear things. So I think the notion of that is that you blind them and thereby make them more able to hear the underlying song of the Arabis, so to speak. That feels nice, but that feels quite sweet. But I don't think that that's something that they necessarily would have done. There is another element in there as well that talks about using the Falmer race as a kind of neural net through the calling which the Dwemer had, that they could communicate across the whole of the Dwemer race, apparently. And so using a similar form of magic or technology or something, they could use the Falmer as a neural net to affect all of the Arabis. That is not something that I really see off the back of this, but I definitely think they were trying to do something to the Falmer. What they were trying to achieve was something that was trying to unbind their bones from the earth before and do that. So it's a form of ascension that they were trying to get to, but I don't think it's something to do with the neural net as such. Exactly what they were trying to achieve, my best thought at the moment is that it has something to do with the blinding and how they were operating for and blinding as such is something that happens to the witness of an antiomorph, that a witness is blinded or maimed or something like that. They were trying. So my thought on that is that they were potentially trying to make the Falmer into a witness for something, some sort of enantiomorph that they were trying to artificially create to potentially understand some of the underlying workings of the Arabis as a whole, but not necessarily that it's a song here. And I just want to pick up on chat because there are some questions here that are possibly still relevant. That Baconomics, I like the idea that the Falmer were an experimental prototype for what the Dwemer tried to do with Numidium. I think that's kind of what they're trying to get at in the Reddit thread, that it's trying to combine them as a race and do something like that. But it feels to me like it's different enough in quality and in tone that it's not necessarily just a straight up prototype as such. It's part of their experimentations with race-wide mystical manipulation, certainly, but I don't think it was a precursor to the Dwemer. Hang on. Mr. Gummy Boy, if the Dwemer were experimenting on the Falmer, they may have messed with their physical bodies instead of their shades or souls, possibly to understand the tonal stuff on physical bodies instead of their souls. Yes, I can see that, but there's no real mention of tonal architecture being deployed in any way other than with the Numidium. So it's possible that that tonal architecture was around at this point, but there's also part of me that thinks is tonal architecture a later development, so to speak, but that happened after the Falmer were being discarded. I don't honestly know for sure. And yeah, that's just a big fat I don't know, I'm afraid, Tristan. But the general idea, it definitely makes sense that they were trying to do something to push the Falmer into being something else. But we don't know enough on the specifics for it to be definite. In terms of the general theory that the Dwemer make the Snow Elves slaves, then I really don't think that's the case. You don't blind people that you want to be useful in any meaningful way. I don't think that if you're trying to make a whole people of slaves, then keeping them as physically able as you can, while still keeping them subservient, is the idea. That if they were trying to just make them into slaves, then they just wouldn't have blinded them at all. Nekin, is Chim a boy or girl's name? My immediate response to that is yes. Or maybe not. But my slightly less flippant thought is that if Chim relates to babies, and possibly relates to the flower baby in Coda, does a flower baby have to have a gendered name? We don't even know what gender the flower baby was, if it had a gender at all, particularly given that Vivek was one of the parents. Then I don't honestly know. Oh, Baconomics is claiming that Kirkbride said they're all girls' names at one point. What was the source for that, if I dare I ask? Okay, but yeah, it's possibly a forum quote we're getting. Okay, so probably a girl's name. I'm not sure that was quite what you meant, Neckin, but you now actually have a kind of serious answer. Wive, how do you interpret the Stacey creation myth? I interpret it with a full episode that I've done after a good amount of research. I know you're desperate for me to do this one, and I will take the time to do a full close read on the Stacey creation myth, and I'm now on record saying that, so I am going to have to do this at some point, although I think the next episode, given the amount of stuff I've been doing on Cyrodiil, we will be doing a history of Cyrodiil more generally. That's the first of one of the more history-related episodes that I've been kind of mulling over and working on, and judging from some of the responses that I've been getting from the survey in Written in Uncertainty, or survey that I've been asking people about on Written in Uncertainty, they'd appreciate that sort of thing. So that's the next episode, and after that, I will do what I can, start looking at the Stacey creation myth, because it's really, frankly, one of the more confusing texts out there. So I want to make sure that I'm getting as much of it as possible before I do the episode. So I also want to do that. So I also will put the link to the survey that I've mentioned in chat now while I think about it, because I'm not sure if anyone, I'm assuming that everyone in chat for now has done it, or at least has seen it to some degree, because of the people who are talking. I'm assuming that everyone in chat for now has done it, but if anyone else pops in and wants to fill it out, there is the link to the URL. If you are coming to this from the podcast, the URL will be in the notes, or in the notes that are attached to the podcast episode. And if you want to affect the direction of the show, please go in, fill that out, and I'll take that into consideration. Aha! And Baconomics has actually, in the meantime, dug out the quote for me. Regarding Chim being pronounced Kim like a girl's name, they're all girls' names. Sure, Chim, Aless, Perif, all Yan, Shoni Et, wait, who? So, yeah, there's a whole bunch of names that have come through there, except I can tie most of those to actual people for the most part. Shoniette is the sister of said Yenna, who discovered Reman. Alessia and Perif are two names for Alesh, who was the one who led the Cyrodiil rebellion. Olyan, I have no idea, if I'm honest, quite why Chim has been flung in there. Well, I don't know, but you have your answer, Neckin. Black Sooth. Oh, and some of these also are coming from comments on the website. Some of them are which is at writteninuncertainty.com. Some of these are coming from emails that I've had at writteninuncertaintypodcast@gmail.com, and some of them are coming from the Discord as well. Links to the Discord and all of those other things will be in the show notes description for the podcast, so check those out and start pinging me ones for the next question and responses episode of this that will come when I have a critical mass. And I have to apologise here for Prawns. You sent me a voice recording which I have not managed to be able to get to behave with Streamlabs, so I can't address your thoughts on the Shezareen just yet. And Black Sooth. If Dwemer believed there were no god or gods, how did they explain the Daedra or Aedra? How did they see them? For an example, maybe they saw them as powerful spirits. Yeah, that's pretty much it. They weren't, as much as Kirkbride has described the Dwemer as atheists in a world where gods exist, they didn't see them as not existing. The tale Azura and the Box, which is likely to be a true Dwemer tale, has some Dwemer interacting directly with Azura, they see them as powerful spirits, as something that is to be used, to be understood, and potentially influenced. I don't really know, but they didn't see them as something that was worthy of worship. That's the main difference. One of Vivek's quotes does say that the Dwemer had their gods of reason and logic, to quote, which possibly means that they were worshipping reason and logic as a system or systems, somehow, rather than necessarily worshipping an entity. Worshipping things and a system seems kind of like it would make sense if they were seeing everything that existed as something that didn't in fact exist, that shouldn't exist, that was absurd because they denied both phenomena and noumena. Then they might have gone for a higher order form of worship as such, and gone for some kind of system of worshipping basic principles that can be deduced, that are mathematical, logical, that sort of thing. But it might just be that they didn't believe in anything and they just followed what they saw as logic, although even logic does still need some kind of premises behind it. It needs a starting point, which makes me think, But yeah, and there was some comments that were made by my patrons as I was collating these notes. If you want to see those notes, then you can always sign up at patreon.com/written in uncertainty. But there was some comments that got made about the book of James, chapter 2, verse 19, which I'm going to look up on the fly because I was foolish enough not to pull it up. So again, bear with me. If you believe there is one God, good, even the demons believe that and shudder. So yeah, it was the idea of acknowledging things rather than worshipping them. And hang on, as for gods of reason and logic, yeah. It's also, there was one of my patrons who has given their full name, and I don't want to disclose that, has also pointed out that science as such in Tamriel won't necessarily be the same as science here. As much as there's reason and logic and stuff going on, it's also a world where magic happens, and the gods do influence things on a regular basis, and dragon breaks happen and so on. So Tamrielic science is not going to look the same thing as earthly science at all. Which is just, I think, a very good point if we're trying to understand how the Dwemer thought about reason and logic relative to how we consider it in this world. And Mr. Gummy Boy has made the point of, like ancient Greek philosophies, said that it was more just understanding, but it would also bring all the sciences under it. Yeah, I can kind of see that, that the Dwemer would have developed or potentially worshipped, or however you want to spin it, a kind of totalizing type of thought, or totalizing system behind everything that was supposed to be a theory of everything, or if you want to be picky and think about how the Dwemer actually saw things, a theory of nothing, which is the same thing as far as the Dwemer are concerned. But yeah, Blacksooth, that's a rather roundabout way of saying they believed that the Aedra and Daedra existed, but they didn't see them as worthy of worship as such. Cal, if the amaranth is the bottom of the gradients chain, so to speak, state, gradient, echo, etc., and that allows the individual who's gotten to this point to become the top of a new gradients chain, what would happen if someone ascended all the way up the gradiences? anti-amaranth. My feeling on that is I'm not sure that that's really possible, because if we're taking the pattern of the Dwemer as a possible example of that, I think what the Dwemer were trying to do in creating the new medium was to have some systematic uncreations, as Baladas Damnavani puts it, to try and recreate themselves as a higher order being. So you would have to, in essence, kind of bundle together all the bits of Tamriel and kind of, I don't know, suck them up into some kind of metaphysical hoover using itself to recombine everything into one entity. That feels hideously complicated, and something that I'm not sure is really possible. But if it were possible, I think you would in essence be usurping the Godhead, that you would actually be achieving the sort of thing to bring about the false dreamer type thing in reality, if you like. So you would actually be achieving the dream of the Sharmat properly, rather than anything else, rather than doing anything else. That's what I think would be going on with that. Yeah. Baconomics. I first heard the dwarf orc theory mentioned as a joke, so I never really bothered to actually read it, but then earlier this year someone brought it up as a joke on the Selectives Lorecast. It might have even been the RK episode. I don't recall how long the series on the Aedra has been going, but Rotten Deadite rebuked them, saying he found the dwarf orc theory to be actually kind of credible, ever since its main proponent eventually returned to Reddit to make a thorough essay-style argument for it, and Deadite encouraged everyone to track it down and read it if they didn't. I was curious and did so, and honestly I have to say there's a lot of merit to it. In fact, there are several fascinating arguments it makes that still stand, even if you disregard the main dwarf equals orc hypothesis. For example, in the last couple of sections, there's a theory presented that a Battle of Red Mountain will occur at the end of linear time, mirroring convention, that to my untrained eye seemed very compelling when I last read it. So my question ultimately is this: does this theory have any merit, either in its main point or otherwise? What counter-arguments exist that the author fails to address? Also, how does the newer lore affect the arguments being made? When I read the theory, its weakest link seemed to be the several assumptions that the author makes about the natures of Xerxes and Zen. My understanding is that in the 5 years since this theory was written, ESO has revealed new lore related to those gods. I don't actually think that ESO's lore is the weakest point in the argument for this, because the book, the book that is RK Xerxes Zen or something like that kind of links together Tuwaka and Xerxes and RK as psychopomps. It suggests the kind of combining or misinterpreting of precisely what the gods are that this argument makes. I will just pull that argument up a second, just so that I can reference that directly, and we can actually start to see how it might link together. The argument is claiming that Zen was a combination of RK and Zen combined with RK to become Xerxes. The text doesn't actually say that Xerxes isn't a combination of things, just that actually thinking about that, Zen and RK becoming Xerxes and then everything else being bundled together, that does kind of strictly throw it by the wayside, but I don't think that the theory actually relies on it too much, because I have a different dwarf orc theory, having thought about it. This theory relies on the orcs being the people of Xerxes, and travelling to the Velothi Mountains for various reasons. I would, to be honest, disregard RK altogether if I was going to make the case that the Dwemer were became the orcs. The reason that I've forgotten his name, and it doesn't show up on the Reddit thread. I want to say Tuvok, but that's really not right. Turok or something like that. The reason the main proponent of the dwarf orc theory links them to Xerxes, I think, is because he wants to link the Dwemer to knowledge and everything that comes out of everything that comes from that, which I can see why you would do that, because it defines a good amount about the Dwemer character. But if I was going for the most logical way of thinking about it, I would still keep the Dwemer as the children of Trinomac directly. That you can then start linking in the Dwemer settling in the Hrothgarian Mountains and attacking Skyrim with all of the stories of the orcs and the Nords fighting together, and Morlock and Ysmir having their mythic, legendary confrontations and so on, and just bundle them all up into one thing, and just say that, that's how that happened. The weakest link to the whole thing, in my view, is the timeline, because the true timeline is that, or the timeline that, as we understand it, is that Trinomac was eaten by Boethia or otherwise disfigured by someone or something, either doing it himself or whatever. But the orcs were created in the Middle Merithic era when the Chimer left. The Chimer already find the Dwemer there when they get to Vardenfell. So if the you either have to have some sort of time shenanigans going on that the orcs and the Dwemer are somehow contemporaneous, so somehow not transformed when the Chimer get to the Velothi Mountains, or potentially what they're also having is, because this theory also does some things with Dragon Breaks, because it links in with the Red Moment and the disappearance of the Dwemer and all that sort of thing. It's saying that rather than disappearing, Kagranak messing around with the tools is what turned the dwarves into the orcs. So from that perspective, you could have the Dwemer being both transformed in the sense of something being misinterpreted, and saying that the Dwemer that the Nords originally fought against were actually the orcs because they're the orcs now, and you've also got them being present in the Velothi Mountains as the general Chimer Exodus thing states, and not yet transformed. So the transformation could have happened then, but that would disregard quite a bit of how the orcs see themselves. You'd have to explain, and I don't think this theory adequately does, how the Battle of Red Mountain and the Chimeric Exodus are in fact the same event. And I don't think this theory does that, particularly because the Chimeric Exodus happens in the Middle Merithic era. It doesn't happen in the Dawn era. If it happens in the Dawn era, and now I think about it, there is actually one source that talks about it happening in the Dawn era. If it happened in the Dawn era, then it would definitely be worth considering, because time is wibbly wobbly then, and so anything can happen. But as it happens in the Middle Merithic era, where time is a bit more stable, then you have to have some serious retroactive shenanigans going on that take a lot more explaining than I'm really prepared to countenance, based on how everything goes so far. What else is there in that theory? I'm just going to see if there's anything else that I can see. There's also a bunch of stuff that I don't think is really necessary in there about how the Battle of Red Mountain affects the Calpic cycle. That's inventing an awful lot of stuff out of whole cloth. It's saying that the Battle of Red Mountain is an event that affects the whole of Mundus, that it's something that was absolutely pivotal, which you can make a case for. There was a comment that MK made on the forums quite a while ago, that was basically saying that why on earth don't the Cyrodiils have a myth about Red Mountain, because it was this big seismic event. And he was saying, well, they probably should have had one, really. Because you think about how many races there are that are involved with the Battle of Red Mountain. You have the Nords, you have the Orcs, you have the Chimera, you have the Dwemer, you have and you have the Khajiit, according to one tale. You're missing the Argonians, you're missing the Cyrodiils, and you're missing the Bretons. But quite apart from anything else. So yeah, it kind of feels like it should be this huge event that's within the history of all of Tamriel, and so it should be some big event, but I don't think how it actually shakes out has enough weight for that. If we're going to say that the Battle of Red Mountain has that sort of effect, then the Middle Dawn should have a similar effect. And I'm not sure it really... Well, actually, no, it does now I think about it, because that's about separating out the Moorish aspects of Oriel and Akatosh and so on and so forth. And following the Middle Dawn, that's kind of what happened, that Akatosh was a Moorish deity and is then something Mannish following the Middle Dawn. So yeah, that could in theory be what's going on with that other Dragon Break. So yeah, that I don't think is actually necessary to the theory, but it's something that's kind of supplementary, I think. Is there anything else in here that's worth talking through? I don't think so at this stage. I will try and do something to look at it with in a bit more depth and kind of unpack everything, rather than just taking a few minutes to unpack it, because it really does deserve looking at and thinking about. It's one of the best pieces of headcanon and backwards reasoning and everything else that TES lore has ever produced, and it's become its own thing. It's absolutely beautiful. So I will try and come up with something that's a bit more thoroughgoing than what I've come up with there. But I think those are the main points. That it does work in terms of deity combining. I think Xerxes is the wrong deity to do it with. And so you can potentially go with Trinomac directly rather than Xerxes, being the thing that's transformed and everything else. But it definitely has some merit, although there is a fair amount of kind of timeline faffery that I don't really think is entirely warranted. And for those of you in chat that want to know this, and I will put it in the show notes because this is all a full record, the link to the theory is now in chat for those of you that want to read it. And next question from Ferric Zorn. Was from a request on an episode originally, so I might have to boil this up a little into an episode, but I want to talk it over in this context just in case there isn't really enough. It's just a comment that it will be interesting to consider the standard account of Jiggalag's relation to Sheogorath and how this has implications for the supposed immutability of the Daedra. Now, the standard account of Jiggalag's relation to Sheogorath is that Jiggalag was getting too powerful in Oblivion, and so the other Daedra ganged up on him and transformed him into Sheogorath. Now, the reason that the Daedra are referred to as immutable is because in the book Aedra and Daedra, it talks about how the Daedra have no connection to creation. And so if they aren't linked to creation and impermanence and everything that goes down with that, immortality and so on, so how can they be altered? I think this is possibly a reflection that we don't really know as much about Oblivion as we think we do. That Oblivion that exists almost separately from other things, from Aetherius particularly, means that the Daedra must have some other kind of existence, that there is this kind of back and forth and almost feudal relationship and so on between the different princes and everyone else. The kind of the politics of Oblivion wouldn't exist if the Daedra were immutable, is my way of thinking about it. And so yes, so the having Jiggalag transformed into Sheogorath is something that would absolutely be possible on that standard account. And Ferric also said that I think a lot of people who played Oblivion might be confused about his absence in Skyrim. That's possible. I think it's more an answer down to game design than anything else, because if you look at pretty much every game in the Elder Scrolls, none of them have all 16 of the Daedric princes getting a quest or being involved in each game. Quite frankly, because that would be hellish to write. I imagine that there would be so much text that would have to be generated, so many bits of storyline that there would barely be room for anything else. And if you look at the games as a whole, the only Daedra who's had a Daedric quest in every single game has been Boethia. It gets a little better if you start looking at the games since Morrowind, because then you get people like Azura always having one, Sheogorath has always had one, but you've always had a selection of some around the fringes that haven't had quests in every game. So it's not necessarily the case that Jiggalag should have had a quest in the Elder Scrolls V, so it's not necessarily that he should have been there. It's also possible that as much as Baconomics, didn't one of the main 16 each have one in Skyrim, or am I misremembering? Okay, that's something that I need to fact check, which I'm going to do on the fly here because I can. Instantly, yes. This is going to be a messy little episode for those of you on the podcast, so my apologies. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, all 16 did have one in Skyrim, Baconomics. In which case, Jiggalag may have been separated from Sheogorath, but does that mean that Jiggalag is a Daedric prince in after he's been separated? This is something I've been chewing over recently in I can't remember where, but I think it was Imperial Knowledge's Discord. But it's kind of what makes a Daedric prince. Having their own realm that they rule feels something relatively basic to me, but then you get into things like Malakath, who aren't necessarily recognised as a Daedra despite having a big presence in Oblivion. And Baconomics has made a similar point, looking down into chat, that the realm and the prince are intrinsically linked. So if you take the prince away from the realm, you've essentially got half a Daedric prince. you've not got a full entity anymore, which means that there's all sorts of questions for what sort of a being Jiggalag has become. And Mr. Gommy Boy, people calling something a Daedric prince is what makes them a Daedric prince. I would take issue with that, particularly because in the book on Oblivion, the author is actually doubting whether or not Hircine is a Daedric prince. And Hircine being a Daedric prince feels something that's been relatively well established in pretty much all of the games that we've played. But that there's some question means that it's not just necessarily the appellation, I don't think, unless there's some sort of shifting politics. Again, we're back to the politics of Oblivion, which we know very little about. But yeah, I think that Hircine could be questioned as a Daedric prince means that it's not just the idea of being called one. And just because of the kind of thematic niceties of the wheel and so on, the 8 spokes and the 16 voids, I don't really want there to be a 17th prince, because that throws that model out of the window. It means that there is almost potentially another Aedra out there or something, and that also means that there should be an 18th Daedric prince in order to even everything out. If I remember how the models of the wheels work properly. But it does have to be a specific type of wheel in order for it to be 8 spokes and 16 voids, which might almost mean that you need 3 more created, because you get 2 more on each side of the hub. But that's getting down into maths, which is not what you're here for. Well, maybe we are. Baconomics. Tinfoil hat theory. Talos is the 9th divine. Lorcan is the 18th Daedra. I really like that. That's really, really elegant. I'm gonna have to think about that and get back to you, Baconomics. I will make a comment on that on the Written and Uncertainty Discord so that we can actually carry that out and just work out all of the maths. Mr. Gommy Boy, maybe that's why the towers are being destroyed, and maybe it's destabilizing the world. I don't think so, because we've got, if the towers are being destroyed, which is an if, because I don't personally think that the towers outside of Adamantia and Red Heart actually stabilise Nirn. If they are being destroyed and it's destabilising the world, then it's going to have been happening before the events of Shivering Isles, because you look at the main quest in Morrowind, that's sometimes seen as the destruction of a tower, the destruction of the Mantella, and so on in the Elder Scrolls 2 after the Warp in the West, is also potentially another destruction of a tower with the Numidium and so on, as with the Mantella as its stone, that sort of thing. So I think there's too many moving parts already for Jiggalag to really be the cause of all the towers getting destroyed. Victorious Viking. On the subject of men and Mer, with Mer claiming direct descent from the Aedra and men claiming to be created by them, where do the Akaviri fall in this? Are they men, Mer, or something different? The annotated Anuad claims that the Saisi are men, and as I said earlier, Mysterious Akavir claims that men once lived on Akavir. You could potentially link them, that the Saisi became men or something, and so on. That something happened to change their state. I would say that if anything, the Saisi are men. You do say Akaviri rather than Saisi as such, but which means that the Kamal and the Capotan and the Tang Mo and everything else would possibly have to be included in that. I don't honestly know. The descriptions of them are enough to be beast folk, but Akaviri beast folk may be something different from Tamrielic beast folk. We just plain don't know enough about them. But yes, as far as we know, there is a probable race of men, in my opinion, in the form of the Saisi. So that's how I would rate that. But that doesn't cover all of the Akaviri. Marek. The soul of Mer, men or beast folk, for each, is it called an animus? And if so, does that mean that someone could be killed and that spirit will eventually return? If that spirit could eventually return, has anyone been purposefully brought back? It's the soul itself is not necessarily called an animus, because the book Spirit of the Daedra has the Daedra as having an animus and not having a soul as such. An animus, as far as I understand it, is part of a soul, not the whole thing. You've got the animus, you've got the anima, and you've got soul energy as things that are mentioned as distinct components that could potentially comprise a soul, rather than necessarily being a soul entirely in and of themselves. So that's what I would think of for precisely what an animus is in relation to a soul. Does that mean that someone who could be killed and that spirit will eventually return? Maybe. We have an example of possible or probable reincarnation with the Nerevarine, the spirit of Nerevar being Nerevar returned, and so on for the Elder Scrolls 3. But quite how far that it was actually Nerevar returning is up for debate. There's part of me that wants to say that the Nerevarine is whoever does what the Nerevarine does, and there's not necessarily any reincarnation of the soul that's involved there. That just feels a bit more elegant to me. But you'll get this from me. I like things because they make my mind and my brain juices go woo, rather than because they're necessarily right. Either one could be the case at this point with the Nerevarine. So the Nerevarine could just be someone who is reincarnated. Exactly how that works, I don't know, because we've got enough examples that within ESO particularly that links memories to water and so on, that suggest some dissolution of who a person is on death. The idea that the soul goes to Aetherius is something that could happen, but exactly what goes to Aetherius and how that relates to what was on Mundus is an open question. If you look at how everything is in Sovngarde, it would suggest that the portraits of the people are still fairly coherent, but that may not be the case for all ethereal realms and such. Mr. Gummy Boy, another conspiracy theory I see here. Maybe the Nerevarine drank some water that contained his memories. Yeah, maybe, but that would imply that they're still condensed. If you go back to listen to my episode on souls in the Elder Scrolls, it kind of suggests that water is soul. If water is soul stuff, then the memory part is likely to be diluted because you can't split it out that well. So I don't think it would just be chugging a glass of water and then just saying, "Oh, I remember stuff now." It's an interesting idea, but I don't know, and hang on. Maybe another comment from Gommy Boy. Maybe having a strong enough will that would be able to hold on to its form or sense of self. Possibly. Now that I think about it, because it mentioning about strength of will and so on, if you look at the book Ancestors and the Dunmer, that says that it's pretty much fairly routine that Dunmer spirits are brought back and they retain some degree of personhood. That there is enough of a spirit for them to come back. Exactly what that means. Well, that's a little different from what Marek is after here, because the spirit may well return, but it's not necessarily reincarnation as such. And yeah, but that's definitely an example of people being brought back from the spirit realm and kind of held in limbo, held in that liminal place between the spirit world and the material world in a very, very definite way. That happens already. And thank you ever so much for listening to the podcast, by the way. You've put some stuff later into the comments saying that you've listened to it during your 100 mile per day journey. That sounds painful. I mean, it's not something I could pull off. So thank you ever so much for listening to me during those times. I hope it's lightened the load for you. And this is the last question, so if anyone else has anything in chat, speak now or hold your questions until the next episode. I will go back through the questions to see, go back through the chat and see if there's anything that I've missed, but this is the last substantive question that I had for this Q&A. From 3 Second Rush. As you always say, I stress this is my understanding of the material and is likely not the whole truth of the matter. The first thing that I would like to address is the apparent contradiction expressed between a desire to return to the old in the traditional Muric manner and the desire to progress to something new. I think this may reference one of the natural consequences of subgradients. Anu broke itself so that it may know itself, and the pieces of Anu further broke themselves, etc. However, having gained greater self-knowledge and changed in the process, these shards of Anu can never be reassembled in the same way that they once were. I think what Deldry's Morvain is expressing in the Truth and Sequence, and potentially Sothosil as well, is that they wish to return to a unified Anu, but they acknowledge that a reunified Anu cannot be the same Anu as before. It will be a new Anu, one that has grown and changed as a result of self-knowledge gained from its sundering. Yes, absolutely. It will be something else that is strung together and recombined and all sorts. The second related thought that I've had is on the topic of Lorkhan's great lie of the duality of Anu and Padme. I think back to Shazar's song and how Shazar described to the gods the concept of becoming mothers and fathers. Mothers and fathers are a duality that must be both combined into a new thing for a new thing to be created. It's possible that in convincing the Etarda to become mothers and fathers, he described to them that they themselves had come from a duality. The child of a mother and a father being distinct individuals, this could also be how he convinced them that they were themselves individuals and not merely parts of a Ninuic whole, as in, alas, they heed the counsel of Lorkhan and forgot the face of Anu. They thought themselves distinct and whole. This could be the general idea that Deldry's Morvain is getting at. Yes, I think so. That the way that that's expressed there could very well be that Lorkhan is kind of cooking up stuff on the fly as to how everything relates. Potentially how a new way for new things to be created or changed. If you think back to Anu and Padme and Nir and the creation of the Arabis as a whole, it was something that was founded on conflict, on the enantiomorph. And so one of the things that Lorkhan was potentially doing was showing another way by introducing the idea of love, families, etc. that almost feels too banal for that to be true, but it has that sort of a ring of truth to it. That, and also what's happening is that in here is that Anu is the whole of the Elder Scrolls universe. That the 36 lessons and the truth in sequence are hinting that there is no duality of Anu and Padme as such, and so Anu is the main thing, which is just another pointing towards Anu as the Amaranth, is the way I would explain it. That Anu hiding himself in the sun as the moment of the Amaranth is the way things are, and that's the truth that Deldry's Morvain is pointing towards. Saying that's all that I have for questions for now, but there was one other point that I wanted to make that came up on Reddit. I posted the "What Have the Remans Ever Done for Us" cast on Reddit, and the user Mystic San put some fantastic points together about some of the stuff that Reman had been up to, basically in ensuring that Tamriel as a whole was still incredibly screwed up and divided and so on. So I'm just going to read that from you just as a way to wrap all this stuff up and point towards some of the Cyrodiil history that we'll be digging into in the future. I'm undecided as yet as to whether we do Cyrodiil or Morrowind as the first all-encompassing history thing that we do on Written in Uncertainty, but it will be one of those two. Mystic Sans says, "In fact, now that I mention the Reach, I miss something about Reman's legacy, his impact and that of his dynasty on the other provinces. Cyrodiil centrism shouldn't make us forget that the roots of many conflicts on Tamriel can be traced back to Reman or his heirs. As mentioned, he divided the Reach between High Rock and Skyrim, forever dooming the Reachmen to be a stateless nation in perpetual conflict with the Bretons and the Nords." Yes, which reminds me of no one so much as the Kurds in real life, now I think about it. The Reman Empire created the parties of the Crowns and the Forebears to aid imperial administration in Hammerfell. On the bright side, it finally granted rights of ownership to the marginalised ancestors of the Forebears, which started a long tradition of imperial sympathies. On the other hand, it also enshrined the entrenched division that has undermined Hammerfell time and time again. Yes, the point where Reman created the Crowns and the Forebears is mentioned in the first edition pocket guide to the Empire. That is something that I managed to entirely pass over when I was actually making this. But it was quoted as, "Under the provincial organisation of the Second Empire, two Red Guard parties formed to aid Cyrodiil's administration in Hammerfell. The ancient Natotembu ruling class retained the rights of the noble council as crowns, and the much-admired warriors of the Regarda were finally granted rights of ownership within their tribal districts." So basically what Reman did was give the formerly voiceless Forebears some sort of power within the structure, but it basically meant that there would forever be infighting in Hammerfell because of those two blocks being formed together. So it kind of begins all of the squabbles of Hammerfell on a rather more major scale. If Reman hadn't have created the Crowns and the Forebears, then the Crowns would have ended up ruling everything, and Hammerfell would have been a lot more stable, I imagine. And next point In another show of divide and conquer colonial administration, the Second Empire also granted independence to Valenwood's regional powers to weaken the power of the Cameron dynasty. That's the beginning of centuries of chronic division and lack of unity in Bosmeri politics. Yeah, that's something that I'd never clocked before and never really understood. The idea that the dynasty in Valenwood is really just there, not really doing very much, but if the Remans are down to it, yeah, that's... Yeah, there's some very, very deliberate slicing up and depowering of existing power structures going on within the Reman Empire. While the amount of imperial control over the Somerset Isles is unclear, the Altmerry version of accommodation and the mention of imperial tithes may suggest that the Isles were a tributary state. It was enough for Tiber Septim to declare Casus Belli, and the quote from the Pocket Guide to the Empire is, "Though no formal declaration of war has been made, Tamriel is divided between the Empire and the elder races, and Tiber Septim has made it known to the Thalmor that he is the true Empire of Cyrodiil and heir to all its former holdings. The elves of Tamriel have yet to answer." And that idea of full heirship to all of Tamriel is derived from Reman's former holdings and so on and so forth, and with everything that entailed. Black Marsh was never fully under imperial control, and the Remans and the potentates decided that it would be perfect as a penal colony, a policy continued by the Septims and that contributed to the Argonians' lack of trust in the Empire. For all the tales about fighting the Dunmer slavers, let's not forget that the An Exiliel's first action was to purge imperial presence and influence from Black Marsh. Yes, all I can say to that one is yes. I can't remember an awful lot about the way that Black Marsh happened, but now I think about it, the war that Reman fought was ended because the Argonians just said, yeah, there's no point in fighting here, let's just carry on. But it was still abused, and the people of Black Marsh were still abused and subjected to bad things, and this would include more than just Argonians at that point as well, because that was pre-Nahat and Flu. And final bit of Mystic Sans comment is, I think it's fair to say that the Second Empire built the foundations of modern Tamriel as we know it, but the consequences were different for each province. Yeah. A detail I like about ESO is how the Daggerfall Covenant idolises the Second Empire, while the Altmerry Dominion and the Ebonheart Pact don't share the same feeling for obvious historical reasons. So yeah, that's something that I managed to entirely miss on my podcast on the Remans, and the impact that they had over all of Tamriel, which was just a huge, huge thing of being a colonial power, and had long-lasting impacts across almost every province in the way that Mystic Sans put it, which is frankly scary. And yeah, that is it for now for the questions and responses episode. Thank you ever so much for joining me, guys, and do feel free to send me more questions so I can start pulling them together to do another episode like this. Drop me a line at writteninuncertaintypodcast@gmail.com, ping me questions on the Discord, or find me on Twitter at Aramithius. And just a note that the survey on the future of Written in Uncertainty is still open, and so there's a link to that in the description. I am not going to try and talk through the URL. It's also somewhere in the chat already if you are in the Twitch chat. So yes, please fill that in and let me know where you want this show to go, and I will do my best to answer questions people want. So thank you ever so much for joining me, and next time we will start our series on looking at all of the various provinces in Tamriel. Precisely which one, I'm yet to make up my mind between Cyrodiil and Morrowind, and I will decide that probably tomorrow before I start digging. Okay, and thank you ever so much for joining me. And until next time, this podcast remains a letter written in uncertainty.